Look at this black homeless dad pretending he actually has rights. Preston Caldwell sneered as he ripped the faded backpack from Darius Bennett's shoulder and hurled it across the dusty construction site. The zipper burst open, scattering a little girl's schoolbooks, a worn teddy bear, and family photographs beneath the tracks of an idling bulldozer. He laughed while Darius instinctively rushed toward the belongings. "Don't touch anything," Preston barked. "This land isn't for black drifters like you. It's for people who actually contribute to this city." As Darius froze, Preston leaned closer with a smug grin. "You should be thanking me. Once this van is gone, maybe you'll finally accept where people like you belong." The guards around him chuckled. Then Preston noticed a cracked photo of Darius's late wife. He slowly placed the heel of his polished shoe on the frame and crushed it into the dirt. When 10-year-old Ava cried and tried to save it, Travis Mercer yanked her back. Preston laughed again, louder than before. "Listen to her cry. Tomorrow she'll probably forget this old van ever existed. Kids from families like yours always learn to live with losing everything." The bulldozer's engine roared. Its massive steel blade began moving toward the only home Darius and Ava had left. Then, a deep rumble echoed across the street. Not thunder, motorcycles, dozens of them. Within seconds, more than 80 riders appeared over the hill, riding straight toward the demolition site, and every pair of eyes locked onto the man kneeling beside the crushed photograph. "If this opening made your blood boil, stay with us until the very end. Because justice is coming in a way no one at that demolition site could have imagined." Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, subscribe and join us for stories where courage always has the final word. Hey folks, I've eaten dinner with strangers more times than I can count, and not once did I regret pulling up a chair. 24 hours earlier, before the roar of 80 motorcycles shook the streets of Phoenix, Darius Bennett's world had already been hanging by a thread. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the cracked windshield of an aging blue cargo van parked behind an abandoned warehouse near Riverside Park. The vehicle was dented, its paint faded by years beneath the Arizona sun, but to Darius and his 10-year-old daughter Ava, it was home. Darius quietly opened his eyes before his daughter woke. Every movement was careful. If he shifted too quickly, the old suspension squeaked loudly enough to wake her. He looked toward the passenger seat. Ava was still asleep, hugging a faded stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to her mother. Her school backpack rested beneath her feet, packed neatly despite having almost nothing inside except 2 notebooks, a pencil pouch, and a library book she insisted on returning on time every week. Darius smiled softly. No matter how difficult life became, he had promised himself that Ava would never stop believing she had a future. He quietly stepped outside. The desert morning was already warm. He poured the last bottle of water into a small cup, washed his face, then checked the folder containing every document he still owned. His birth certificate, his driver's license, old mechanic certifications, letters of recommendation from customers who once trusted him with expensive classic cars. The papers were worn, but he kept them clean inside a plastic sleeve as though they were treasures, because they were. They were proof that he had once lived a different life. 3 years earlier, Darius had owned a respected neighborhood auto repair shop. Customers often waited weeks for him to work on vintage Mustangs, Camaros, and pickup trucks. Then his wife Monica became seriously ill. Insurance covered almost nothing. Medical bills swallowed every dollar they had. He sold the shop, then the house, then every tool he owned. When Monica finally lost her battle with cancer, Darius and Ava were left with only an old van and memories that hurt too much to revisit. He never blamed her. He only blamed himself for never finding a way to save her. "Dad." A sleepy voice came from inside the van. Ava rubbed her eyes before climbing into the front seat. "Good morning." "Morning, sweetheart." She looked around. "Did you eat already?" Darius smiled. "I grabbed something earlier." It was another small lie. There had been nothing to eat since yesterday afternoon. Ava knew. She simply pretended to believe him. Instead of arguing, she reached into her backpack and handed him half of a granola bar she had secretly saved from school the previous day. "I wasn't that hungry yesterday." Darius stared at the broken piece for a long moment. "You keep it." She folded his fingers around it. "We share." His eyes grew wet, but he forced another smile. They shared the tiny snack in silence. It lasted less than a minute. By 8 o'clock, Darius walked nearly 2 miles to a busy industrial district, carrying his document folder beneath one arm. A handwritten sign outside a repair garage read, "Mechanic Wanted." Hope flickered inside him. The owner, a middle-aged man named Carl Simmons, looked through Darius's certifications with raised eyebrows. "You've rebuilt transmission systems." "Yes, sir." "Diesel." "For almost 12 years." "Electrical diagnostics." Darius nodded. Carl seemed impressed. "We actually need someone with your experience." For the first time in weeks, Darius allowed himself to imagine bringing groceries back to Ava. Then Carl asked the question Darius dreaded most. "What's your address?" Silence. "I don't currently have permanent housing." Carl's expression changed immediately. "You mean you're homeless?" "For now." Carl slowly closed the folder. "I'm sorry." "My work hasn't changed," Darius answered quietly. "I know," Carl sighed, "but my insurance company won't approve employees without a permanent address." Darius understood what that sentence really meant. The interview was over. As he turned to leave, Carl called after him. "For what it's worth, I think you'd make a great mechanic." Darius smiled politely. "Thank you." Outside, the Arizona heat felt even heavier. By noon, he had visited 4 more businesses. At one warehouse, he was told the position had just been filled. At another, no one even accepted his application. The 5th employer never looked beyond his worn boots before saying, "We're not hiring." Darius knew they were. He had seen the sign in the window. Around 1 o'clock, he finally reached Hope Haven Community Kitchen. A volunteer recognized him immediately. "I'm sorry, Darius." "What happened?" She looked embarrassed. "We had far more families than usual today." She reached beneath the counter and handed him a small paper bag. "This is the last meal we have." Inside was a simple turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. It wasn't enough for 2 people. Darius thanked her anyway. As he stepped outside, he stared at the bag for several seconds. He imagined Ava smiling when she saw the sandwich. He imagined pretending he had already eaten. Again, he started walking back toward the van beneath the relentless afternoon sun, unaware that within the next hour, a single unexpected encounter on a lonely roadside would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who believed kindness no longer mattered. Darius Bennett tightened his grip on the small paper bag as he left Hope Haven Community Kitchen. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning the sidewalks into shimmering waves of heat. Inside the bag sat a simple turkey sandwich, a crisp apple, and a bottle of water, the last meal the shelter had available that day. It wasn't much, but to Ava, it would feel like a feast. He smiled faintly. already planning the familiar lie. I had lunch while filling out applications. She never challenged him anymore. That realization hurt more than hunger itself. Children weren't supposed to become experts at recognizing the sacrifices their parents tried to hide. Darius crossed an empty intersection and took the shortcut along an old frontage road that paralleled the interstate. The route was quieter, though almost no one walked there during the hottest part of the day. A strange sound drifted through the silence. A motorcycle engine coughed once, then twice, then nothing. Darius looked toward the shoulder of the road. Nearly 100 yards away, a large touring motorcycle had rolled onto the gravel. Beside it sat an older man wearing a black leather riding vest. His helmet lay several feet away, while one trembling hand pressed against the fuel tank. At first, Darius assumed the rider was simply repairing the bike. Then he noticed the man's shoulders shaking. The biker tried to stand. His legs immediately gave way. He collapsed against the motorcycle before sliding slowly onto the scorching pavement. Without thinking, Darius sprinted forward. "Sir." The older man barely opened his eyes. His lips were dry. His breathing was shallow. "I'm fine," he whispered. "No, you're not." Darius knelt beside him, shielding his face from the burning sunlight. "Can you hear me?" The man nodded weakly. When was the last time you ate?" A long pause followed. "I don't remember." Darius glanced around. No cars stopped. Traffic rushed past, only a few yards away, yet no one seemed to notice an elderly rider lying beside the road. He reached for his phone. No signal. The dead zone stretched across this part of the frontage road. Darius looked down at the paper bag in his hand, then back at the exhausted stranger. For one brief moment, he pictured Ava waiting inside the van. She would be hungry. She trusted him. She believed he would always come back with something. His fingers tightened around the bag. The decision should have been impossible. Instead, it lasted only a heartbeat. Darius opened the paper bag and gently placed the sandwich into the man's shaking hands. "You need this more than I do." The biker blinked. "No. Your family. They'll understand." He unscrewed the bottle of water and helped the man drink a few slow sips before encouraging him to eat. Color gradually returned to the stranger's face. The trembling eased. Only then did Darius allow himself to exhale. The biker looked at him with disbelief. "You don't even know me." Darius smiled tiredly. "I don't have to." The older man's eyes wandered toward the nearly empty paper bag. "You gave me everything." Darius shrugged. "Someone once told me that kindness only counts when it costs you something." The biker stared silently for several seconds. "My name is Walter." "Darius!" Walter extended an unsteady hand. Darius shook it. "You saved me today, Darius." "I just shared lunch." Walter slowly shook his head. "No." His voice cracked with emotion. "You shared hope." Before Darius could respond, Walter reached into his leather vest and pulled out a thick wallet. "Please." Darius immediately raised a hand. "I can't." Walter removed several $100 bills. "Take it." Darius stepped backward. "I didn't help you for money." "Then let me help your daughter." The words caught Darius off guard. "You mentioned your family." Darius looked toward the paper bag again. Only the apple remained. He quietly placed it beside Walter. "She can wait one more meal." Walter's eyes widened. "That's all you have left?" Darius smiled gently. "We've survived worse days." Walter's voice grew firm. "At least tell me where I can find you." Darius hesitated. For the first time, Embarrassment crossed his face. I'd rather you remember me having some dignity. Walter frowned. What does that mean? It means I don't have an address. Silence settled between them. Walter looked at the faded clothes, the worn work boots, the calloused hands, the plastic folder of mechanic certificates resting beside Darius's knee. He finally understood. Darius wasn't simply struggling. He was homeless. Yet despite having almost nothing, he had just given away everything he planned to feed his daughter. Walter lowered his head. He had spent decades meeting powerful people, business owners, politicians, veterans, celebrities. Very few had ever shown him the kind of generosity he had witnessed in the last 5 minutes. A distant engine approached. Another motorcycle appeared around the curve. It stopped immediately. A younger rider hurried over. Chief, he dropped to one knee. We've been searching everywhere. I'm all right, Marcus. Marcus Turner looked between Walter and Darius. What happened? Walter answered quietly. This man saved my life. Marcus immediately extended his hand. Thank you, sir. Darius shook it awkwardly. It wasn't a big deal. Walter almost laughed. It was the biggest deal of my day. Marcus noticed the empty food bag. His expression slowly changed. He understood. Walter looked back toward Darius. Please, tell me where you live. Darius glanced at the old van, barely visible in the distance beyond the trees. Then he looked at Ava's library book sticking out of his folder. My little girl is waiting. He smiled apologetically. I shouldn't keep her. Before either biker could stop him, Darius picked up his document folder and quietly walked away beneath the blazing Arizona sun. Marcus watched in silence. Should I go after him? Walter never took his eyes off Darius's retreating figure. No. Why not? Because a man who gives away his last meal without expecting anything in return deserves more than gratitude. Walter slowly stood. We're going to find him. Marcus nodded. How hard can that be? Walter's expression turned thoughtful as Darius disappeared around the corner. I have a feeling. He doesn't want to be found. Neither of them realized that less than 24 hours later, the search for one homeless father would bring together an entire brotherhood and place them directly in the path of a ruthless developer who believed money could silence anyone. The walk back to the old cargo van felt longer than usual. Every step reminded Darius Bennett that he had nothing left to offer except honesty. When he reached the abandoned warehouse, Ava was sitting on the curb with her library book open across her knees. The moment she saw him, her face lit up. You made it. She hurried over and wrapped her arms around his waist. Darius hugged her tightly. For a second, he wished time would stop. Ava noticed the nearly empty paper bag. You gave it away, didn't you? Darius looked down. I'm sorry. She didn't ask another question. Instead, she reached into the bag, picked up the apple, and smiled. We can split this. His throat tightened. You should eat it. She shook her head. We always share. They sat together beneath the thin shade cast by the warehouse wall. Darius carefully sliced the apple into 2 uneven pieces with his old pocket knife. Without saying anything, Ava quietly exchanged the larger half for the smaller one while he wasn't looking. He noticed. He pretended he hadn't. Children should never have to learn how to hide kindness from their parents. As the sun began to sink, they talked about better days. When I grow up, Ava said, I'm going to build you the biggest garage in Arizona. Darius laughed softly. Really? And you'll never have to ask anyone for a job again. He smiled. I'd like that. She pointed toward the faded mechanic certificates inside his plastic folder. Mom always said you could fix anything. He stared toward the horizon. Not everything. Silence settled between them. Ava gently slipped her hand into his. You fixed me. Darius turned to her. What do you mean? You keep me from being scared. He looked away before she could see tears filling his eyes. That evening, after Ava fell asleep inside the van, Darius remained awake, sitting in the driver's seat. He unfolded another job application beneath the weak light of a battery-powered lantern. Every blank space asking for an address remained impossible to answer. Eventually, he folded the paper away. Tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow someone would care more about his skills than where he slept. Just before dawn, the growl of heavy diesel engines shattered the silence. Darius opened his eyes instantly. Large construction vehicles rolled slowly toward the empty lot. Behind them came several black pickup trucks marked with the logo of Caldwell Urban Properties. His stomach dropped. Ava stirred awake. Dad. It's okay. But it wasn't. Men wearing reflective safety vests climbed from the trucks. Orange fencing was unloaded. Survey markers were hammered into the ground. Residents living in tents nearby stepped outside, confused and frightened. A woman carrying a baby asked what was happening. No one answered. Then another black SUV pulled onto the dirt road. Its polished paint reflected the rising sun. The driver's door opened. A tall man in an expensive navy suit stepped out without looking at anyone around him. Preston Caldwell. He surveyed the property as if examining empty land instead of human lives. Melissa Pierce hurried beside him, carrying a clipboard. The equipment is ready. Good. And security has cleared the entrance. Excellent. Preston finally glanced toward the collection of tents and old vehicles. His expression showed no emotion. Have everything removed. Darius walked forward, keeping Ava behind him. Excuse me, sir. Preston barely acknowledged him. This property isn't abandoned, Darius continued. Families are living here. Preston smiled faintly. Not for much longer. We were told the city review wasn't finished. It is now. Can we at least have time to gather our things? Preston looked at his watch. You've got 10 minutes. Before Darius could respond, Travis Mercer approached with half a dozen security guards. They immediately began ordering everyone to move. An elderly veteran tried explaining that he needed help packing his medical equipment. One guard kicked over a plastic storage bin instead. A young mother begged for another hour. Her request was ignored. Panic spread across the lot. People rushed in every direction trying to save what little they owned. Darius climbed into the van, stuffing blankets, family photographs, clothes, and Ava's school supplies into cardboard boxes. His hands shook. Everything they owned fit into 3 small boxes. Ava carefully lifted the framed photograph of her mother. I'll carry this. Darius nodded. Be careful. Outside, bulldozers slowly moved into position. Their engines rumbled like distant thunder. One operator lowered the massive steel blade only a few feet from Darius's van. Travis shouted across the lot. Time's up. We need 5 more minutes, Darius called back. No. My daughter. I said move. Darius stepped between the bulldozer and the van. This is our home. Travis smirked. Not anymore. Across the lot, Preston Caldwell watched the confrontation with complete indifference. To him, the old van was nothing more than another obstacle delaying construction. To Darius, it held every memory he still had of Monica. It was the only place Ava still called home. Neither father nor daughter noticed that hundreds of miles away, Walter Steel Wolf Ramsey had already begun making phone calls, that would soon change everything. But for now, standing before a roaring bulldozer with nowhere left to go, Darius could only pray that anyone would hear their cries before it was too late. "Move him!" Travis Mercer didn't shout. He didn't have to. Two security guards immediately grabbed Darius Bennett by both arms and dragged him away from the front of the bulldozer. "Dad!" Ava screamed as she ran toward him, but Vanessa Pierce stepped in front of the little girl. "Stay back." "Let go of my dad." Vanessa barely looked at her. "This is an active construction site." Darius struggled against the guards. "My daughter's still inside the van." "No, she's not," Travis replied coldly. "She's standing right there. Our documents are still inside. Our family pictures, my wife's belongings." Travis shrugged. "Should have packed faster." The bulldozer lurched forward. Its steel blade slammed into the rusted front bumper of the old cargo van. The sound of twisting metal echoed across the vacant lot. Ava covered her ears. "Dad." Darius felt something inside him break, not because the van was valuable, because it was the last place where Monica had laughed, where Ava had celebrated birthdays with cupcakes from the dollar store, where three people had once believed life would get better. The blade pushed harder. Glass exploded across the dirt. The windshield shattered into thousands of glittering fragments. Several people living in nearby tents began crying openly. One elderly veteran removed his cap and quietly turned away. Even a few construction workers looked uncomfortable, but Preston Caldwell never blinked. He watched as if he were observing nothing more than another abandoned vehicle being hauled away. "Enough!" Darius shouted. He wrenched one arm free and ran toward the van. Before he reached it, Officer Daniel Foster stepped directly into his path. "Sir, stop!" "My daughter's medicine is inside." "I said stop." "I only need 30 seconds. Darius tried to move around him. The officer grabbed his wrist. The struggle lasted only moments. Metal handcuffs clicked shut around Darius's wrists. Everything went silent. Ava stared at the handcuffs in disbelief. "No." She rushed toward her father. Officer Foster gently blocked her. "He isn't under arrest for being homeless." "Then why are you taking him?" The officer hesitated. "Because he resisted." Darius lowered his head. "I wasn't resisting." His voice trembled. "I was trying to save what little my daughter has left." Officer Foster didn't answer. Deep inside, he knew the man was telling the truth. But orders were orders. Across the lot, Preston glanced briefly toward the scene before turning back to Melissa. "Have the rest cleared within the hour? What about the personal property? Dispose of it." Melissa looked uncertain. "There are children's belongings." Preston's expression hardened. "I said dispose of it." Nearby, Travis kicked one of Darius's cardboard boxes aside. Books spilled across the ground. A small pair of sneakers landed in the dust. Then something else slid out. A framed photograph. Monica Bennett smiled back from the picture, her arm wrapped around a much younger Ava, while Darius stood behind them, wearing grease-stained mechanic overalls. It had been taken during happier times outside his old repair shop. Travis picked it up. "Think this is worth anything?" Before Darius could answer, Travis tossed it carelessly onto the dirt. The glass cracked. Ava ran toward it. "No." She dropped to her knees and carefully lifted the broken frame against her chest. Tiny cuts appeared on her fingers, where shattered glass clung to the edges. She didn't seem to notice. She only wiped dirt from her mother's smiling face. Darius felt tears burn his eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." "You don't have to be sorry." Her voice shook. We still have Mom. She pressed the damaged picture tightly against her heart. We still remember. Even several workers nearby quietly looked away. One young equipment operator climbed down from his machine. Boss? He approached Preston carefully. Maybe we should give them another hour. Preston stared at him. Do you own this company? No, sir. Then get back in your machine. The operator didn't move. Preston's tone sharpened. Or clean out your locker. Without another word, the young man climbed back into the bulldozer. He hated himself for doing it. Sometimes keeping a paycheck meant sacrificing pieces of your conscience. Officer Foster finally guided Darius toward a patrol car parked near the entrance. I don't want trouble, the officer said quietly. Neither do I. Darius looked back toward Ava. Can I talk to my daughter? The officer nodded. Only 1 minute. Darius knelt despite the handcuffs. Ava. She wiped away tears. I'm right here. Listen to me. She nodded. No matter what happens, you don't stop reading. She looked confused. You keep going to school. What if they move us? You'll still go. What if you're not there? His voice almost failed. You remember what Mom always said? Ava whispered the words with him. Our address doesn't decide our future. He smiled through tears. That's my girl. Rachel Monroe, a volunteer from Hope Haven Community Kitchen, suddenly pushed through the growing crowd. Darius! She had been delivering supplies nearby when she heard about the eviction. What happened? They're taking my dad. Rachel immediately looked toward Officer Foster. I know this family. They're good people. I'm only transporting him. Rachel nodded. I'll stay with Ava. Darius looked relieved for the first time that morning. Thank you. Rachel squeezed his shoulder. I promise. As the patrol car pulled away, Ava stood clutching the broken photograph with one hand, while Rachel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Neither of them noticed that hundreds of miles away, Walter Steel Wolf Ramsey stood inside the headquarters of the Steel Brotherhood Riders. More than 30 motorcycles already filled the parking lot. Marcus Turner had just finished pinning a map of Phoenix onto the wall. We checked hospitals. Walter nodded. No sign. We checked shelters. Nothing. We're running out of places. Walter remained silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest and removed the folded napkin that had wrapped the sandwich Darius had given him. He looked at the faint grease stain left behind, a reminder that a starving father had chosen a stranger over himself. Walter carefully folded it again. We're not giving up. Marcus looked around the room as more riders continued arriving. How many brothers are answering the call? Walter glanced toward the growing line of motorcycles outside the window. His answer came without hesitation. As many as it takes. Neither man realized that fate itself was already leading them toward the very demolition site where a little girl stood holding a shattered photograph, the last unbroken piece of her family. The ride to the police station was painfully quiet. Officer Daniel Foster glanced several times through the rearview mirror. Darius Bennett sat with his cuffed hands resting on his knees. He wasn't angry. He was worried. His thoughts never left Ava. Officer, he said softly. Daniel looked up. Yes, my daughter. I know. She has no one except me. Daniel hesitated before answering. The volunteer said she'll stay with her. I hope she keeps that promise. The patrol car rolled into the station parking lot. Within an hour, Darius was placed in a small holding room while paperwork was completed. The charge was minor, obstructing a lawful operation, but until the paperwork cleared, He couldn't leave. Daniel stood outside the door reading the incident report. Something about it felt wrong. The report claimed Darius had become violent. That wasn't what Daniel had seen. He remembered a desperate father trying to reach his daughter's medicine. Nothing more. Across town, Rachel Monroe guided Ava into Hope Haven Community Kitchen after convincing the shelter director to let the little girl stay until her father returned. A volunteer placed a warm bowl of chicken soup in front of her. Ava thanked her politely. She never touched the spoon. Instead, she kept staring at the cracked photograph of her mother. Rachel quietly sat beside her. "You should eat something." Ava gently shook her head. "My dad always eats after I do." Rachel smiled sadly. "He'd want you to be strong." Ava whispered. "He told me we always share." Without another word, Rachel picked up another bowl, divided both portions equally, and placed half beside Ava. "Then we'll share too." For the first time that day, the little girl managed a faint smile. Meanwhile, nearly 40 miles outside Phoenix, motorcycles continued arriving at the Steel Brotherhood Riders headquarters. The parking lot was almost full. Leather vests from chapters across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico reflected beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the clubhouse, Walter "Steel Wolf" Ramsey stood before a large map. Marcus Turner pinned another red marker. Still nothing. Another rider walked in carrying a laptop. "I searched every shelter registration made today." Walter looked up hopefully. No match. The rider slowly shook his head. Marcus folded his arms. "We're searching for one homeless man in a city of more than 1 million people." Walter's expression never changed. "We're searching for the right man." Silence settled over the room. Finally, Walter reached into his vest and removed Darius's mechanic certification card. He had noticed it when Darius accidentally dropped the folder beside the motorcycle. One corner of the card had torn away, but the name remained visible. Darius Bennett, Certified Master Automotive Technician. Marcus studied it. So he wasn't always homeless. No. Walter looked thoughtful. Hands like his don't come from begging. He turned the card over. A faded logo caught his attention. Bennett Performance Auto. Walter frowned. The name stirred a distant memory. "Marcus." "Yeah. Didn't your Road King break down outside a place with that name years ago?" Marcus blinked. Then his eyes widened. "Wait." He stared at the card again. It was him. Walter looked up. "You remember, I was stranded during a charity ride." Marcus smiled to himself. "My wallet had been stolen the night before." Walter listened carefully. "I offered to leave my watch as collateral. And," Marcus laughed quietly, "he refused." "What did he say?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "He told me, 'Good people don't need collateral. Just promise you'll help somebody else when you can.'" The clubhouse became completely silent. Walter slowly closed his eyes. He never mentioned that yesterday. "He didn't recognize me." "No." Walter looked toward the dozens of riders gathered around them. He didn't expect anything in return. At that moment, Jonathan Reed, the club's longtime legal advisor, entered carrying a thick folder. "I've got something." Walter immediately turned. "What is it?" Jonathan placed several documents on the table. "I started looking into Caldwell Urban Properties after hearing Marcus describe the demolition. He spread out maps and city records. The timeline doesn't make sense." Walter leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "The city council hasn't approved the final redevelopment permit." Marcus frowned. "Then how were they demolishing homes?" Jonathan tapped another page. "They shouldn't have been." He pointed toward a signed authorization. This temporary clearance only allows land surveys. Walter's expression darkened. No demolition. No forced removals. No destruction of personal property. Marcus stared at the paperwork. So Preston Caldwell lied. Jonathan nodded. It appears someone is acting as though they already own legal authority they don't actually have. Walter folded his arms. Can you prove it? Jonathan smiled. I think we're about to. He slid a flash drive across the table. One of the survey contractors contacted me anonymously. Walter raised an eyebrow. Why? Because he couldn't stomach what he witnessed this morning. The room fell silent. He secretly copied internal emails. Marcus leaned forward. What do they show? Jonathan looked directly at Walter. If these files are authentic. Preston Caldwell ordered the demolitions before receiving city approval. Walter's jaw tightened. What about the families? They were never supposed to be removed today. Marcus exhaled sharply. So Darius lost everything. Because someone decided the law was optional. Walter slowly looked around the clubhouse. Nearly 80 riders had gathered by then. Many were veterans. Some were retired police officers. Others owned successful businesses. Every face carried the same expression. Quiet determination. Walter carefully placed Darius's mechanic card back into his pocket. This isn't just about paying back a favor anymore. No. Jonathan closed the folder. This is about stopping a crime. Walter nodded once. Then he spoke the words that sent every rider reaching for his helmet. We leave at first light. The first light of morning painted the Phoenix skyline in pale gold. For Darius Bennett, it brought no warmth. Officer Daniel Foster unlocked the holding room and removed the handcuffs. The prosecutor declined to file charges. He said quietly, "You're free to go." Darius rubbed his sore wrists. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated before handing him a small envelope. Someone from Hope Haven dropped this off? Inside were $23 a city bus pass and a handwritten note from Rachel Monroe. Ava is safe. She's waiting for you. Don't lose hope. Darius closed his eyes in relief. Thank you, he whispered, unsure whether he was speaking to Daniel or Rachel. Daniel cleared his throat. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. Darius looked at him. You were doing your job. Daniel shook his head. No. His voice grew heavier. I forgot what my job was supposed to protect. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Darius extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly. I hope things get better for you. So do I. Hope Haven Community Kitchen was unusually quiet that morning. The moment Ava saw her father walking through the front door, she sprinted across the room. Dad! She nearly knocked him over. Darius wrapped both arms around her, holding her tighter than he ever had before. I missed you. I knew you'd come back. Rachel smiled from across the room. You two deserve a little privacy. Before walking away, she slipped a small paper bag into Darius's hand. Breakfast. Darius immediately tried to refuse. You've already done enough. Rachel folded his fingers around the bag. No. She smiled warmly. Someone once told me kindness only matters when it costs something. Darius froze. Those were the exact words he had spoken to Walter. Rachel laughed softly. I've learned a lot from people like you. For the first time in many months, Darius felt something unfamiliar. Hope. That feeling lasted less than an hour. A volunteer rushed through the front entrance carrying a tablet. Rachel, she looked up. What happened? The demolition crews are back. Darius's smile disappeared instantly. They're still there. They brought more equipment. Rachel looked toward Darius. They're clearing everything that was left. Without another word, Darius grabbed Ava's hand. We have to go. When they reached the vacant lot, clouds of dust already filled the air. Everything looked different. The tents were gone. Shopping carts had disappeared. Blankets, clothing, and family keepsakes had been piled into dumpsters. The place no longer resembled a community. It looked like it had never existed. Darius slowly walked toward the crushed remains of his van. Its roof had been flattened. The windshield was gone. Doors hung twisted from broken hinges. He stood silently. Ava squeezed his hand. Dad. He knelt beside the wreckage. His fingers brushed across the steering wheel. Every memory returned at once. Teaching Ava to read inside the van during rainstorms, celebrating her birthdays with tiny cupcakes, listening to Monica sing softly while traffic passed outside. It hadn't been much, but it had been theirs. A deep voice interrupted his thoughts. Well, Preston Caldwell stepped from his SUV, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. You came back. Darius slowly stood. I came for what belongs to my family. Preston laughed. There isn't much left. You had no right to destroy our home. I had every right. No, a calm voice answered from behind. You didn't. Jonathan Reed walked onto the lot carrying a leather briefcase. Preston narrowed his eyes. And who are you? An attorney. Jonathan held up several documents. I'd advise you to stop all demolition activities immediately. Preston barely glanced at the papers. I don't take legal advice from strangers. Jonathan smiled politely. You might when the court orders you to. Preston stepped closer. This property belongs to Caldwell Urban Properties. Jonathan nodded. Eventually. What does that mean? It means your redevelopment permit hasn't been finalized. For the first time, Preston's smile faded. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Jonathan opened the folder. The city only approved preliminary surveys. He held up another page. You authorized full demolition. Another document. You ordered private security to remove residents. Another. You destroyed personal property. Jonathan looked directly into Preston's eyes. Then every one of those actions violated state law. Travis Mercer stepped forward. Boss. Preston ignored him. Instead, he leaned toward Jonathan. How much? Jonathan frowned. What? Everyone has a price. Jonathan slowly closed the folder. You just made another mistake. I can write any check you want. Jonathan smiled. I stopped selling my integrity a long time ago. Nearby, several construction workers quietly gathered, pretending to inspect equipment while listening to every word, Preston noticed. His voice grew louder. Security. Travis immediately approached. I'll escort these people off my property. Darius stepped protectively in front of Ava. Jonathan remained perfectly calm. You touch my client again, and I'll add retaliation to the lawsuit. Travis hesitated. He looked toward Preston. Preston's face hardened. Do it. Before Travis could take another step, the distant sound of engines drifted across the desert. Low, rhythmic, growing louder by the second. One construction worker looked toward the highway. What is that? Another removed his hard hat. I think those are motorcycles. The rumble intensified until even the bulldozers seemed quiet by comparison. Every head slowly turned. A long line of headlights appeared over the distant rise. One motorcycle, then 5, then 20, then more. The procession stretched farther than anyone could count. Black leather vests reflected beneath the morning sun as dozens upon dozens of riders rolled toward the construction site in perfect formation. Preston frowned. "What the hell?" Jonathan smiled for the first time since arriving. "They're right on time." Darius stared in complete confusion. He had no idea why nearly 80 motorcycles were heading directly toward him. But somewhere near the front of that endless line rode an older man who had never forgotten the starving father who chose compassion over his own hunger. And in only a few moments, the entire city would learn exactly who Walter Steel Wolf Ramsey really was. The thunder of motorcycle engines swallowed every other sound on the construction site. Bulldozers idled, workers lowered their tools. Even the security guards instinctively stepped backward as the endless procession rolled through the entrance. One motorcycle, 10, 20, 40. The line kept growing until more than 80 motorcycles surrounded the entire demolition site in a wide semicircle. No one spoke. The only sound was the synchronized rumble of powerful V-twin engines echoing across the desert morning. Preston Caldwell's confidence began to crack. "Who invited these people?" Travis Mercer swallowed nervously. I don't know." Every rider shut off his engine almost simultaneously. Silence fell over the property. Then the lead rider slowly removed his helmet. Walter Steel Wolf Ramsey stepped off his motorcycle. His silver beard moved gently in the warm breeze as he looked across the crowd. His eyes stopped on Darius. For a long moment, neither man moved. Darius frowned. It took him several seconds to recognize the older biker from the roadside. Walter smiled. "You remembered." Darius looked completely confused. "What are you doing here?" Walter walked forward without answering. The crowd instinctively parted. Construction workers, police officers, volunteers, even Preston's own security team stepped aside. Walter stopped only a few feet away. Then, in front of everyone watching, he wrapped both arms around Darius in a firm embrace. "Brother," he said quietly. The single word carried across the silent lot. Darius stood frozen. "You found me." Walter pulled back and looked directly into his eyes. "I told you I'd find the man who saved my life." Sir Preston interrupted with an impatient laugh. "This is touching." His sarcastic applause echoed across the site. "But unless your biker club owns this property, you're trespassing." Walter slowly turned toward him. "You must be Preston Caldwell. And you are someone who doesn't appreciate watching decent people lose everything." Preston smirked. "This isn't your business." Walter's expression remained calm. "It became my business yesterday." He pointed toward Darius. "That man gave away the only meal his little girl had." Several workers exchanged surprised looks. Walter continued. "He didn't know my name. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for favors. He saw a stranger dying beside the road and chose compassion instead of comfort." The construction site grew completely silent. Walter reached into his vest and carefully unfolded the grease-stained sandwich wrapper he had kept since the day before. "I've carried this with me because it reminds me what real character looks like." He looked around at everyone gathered. Yesterday, this wrapper held the last meal a homeless father could afford. He folded it again. Today, he turned back toward Darius. "It reminds 80 men why we're here." One by one, the riders removed their helmets. Many had gray hair. Some wore military service patches. Others displayed firefighter insignias, police memorial pins, or charity ride emblems sewn onto their leather vests. They weren't a gang. They were a brotherhood. Marcus Turner stepped forward. He smiled at Darius. "You probably don't remember me." Darius searched his face. "I'm sorry. My motorcycle broke down outside your garage almost 8 years ago." Recognition slowly appeared. "The Blue Road King," Marcus laughed. "That's the one. You refused to charge me. You had your wallet stolen." Marcus nodded. "You told me." Together they finished the sentence. "Just help somebody else when you can." Darius stared in disbelief. I never expected." "No." Marcus smiled warmly. "You never expected anything." Another rider approached, then another. An older woman wearing a riding vest stepped forward. "You repaired my son's truck before he deployed overseas." A retired firefighter extended his hand. "You fixed our charity trailer after everyone else said it couldn't be repaired." A small business owner spoke next. "You stayed 3 hours after closing, just so my delivery van could be ready for work the next morning." Story after story echoed across the construction site. Every one of them described the same man, a mechanic who had quietly helped people without asking for recognition. Darius lowered his head. "I was only doing my job." Walter gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "No. You were changing lives." Across the lot, Ava clung tightly to Rachel Monroe's hand. "Dad helped all those people." Rachel smiled through tears. "He did. But he never told me. The kindest people usually don't." Preston suddenly stepped forward again. "I've had enough." His voice regained some of its arrogance. "I don't care how many sentimental stories you tell." He pointed toward the riders. "This is still private property." Walter calmly nodded. "For now." Jonathan Reed walked beside him, carrying the same leather briefcase. "I was hoping you'd say that." He opened the case and removed several documents. Then he handed one directly to Officer Daniel Foster. The officer quickly scanned the first page. His expression immediately changed. "What is this, a temporary court injunction?" Daniel looked again. "It orders all demolition activity to stop immediately pending judicial review." Jonathan handed him another document. "And this authorizes an investigation into possible unlawful property destruction." Daniel looked toward Preston. "Mr. Caldwell." Preston's face turned pale. Jonathan wasn't finished. He produced a flash drive. "This contains internal emails from your own project managers." He held it up for everyone to see. "Emails showing that you knowingly ordered demolitions before receiving legal authorization." Murmurs spread through the workers. Several security guards looked uneasily at one another. Travis Mercer took an involuntary step backward. Preston forced a laugh. "You can't prove those emails are real." Jonathan smiled. "Actually." He nodded toward the entrance. "We won't have to." Everyone turned. 3 television news vans rolled slowly onto the property. Behind them came additional vehicles marked with local media logos. Reporters hurried out carrying cameras already broadcasting live. One reporter spoke directly into her microphone. "We're coming to you live from Phoenix, where serious allegations have emerged against Caldwell Urban Properties following today's attempted demolition." Preston's confident expression finally disappeared. Walter looked calmly at Darius. "I told you yesterday that kindness matters." He glanced toward the growing crowd of reporters. "Now the whole country is about to find out why." Within minutes, the quiet demolition site had transformed into the center of every major news broadcast in Phoenix. Camera crews spread across the property. Microphones appeared in every direction. Reporters interviewed displaced families while drone cameras hovered overhead, capturing the rows of bulldozers that had suddenly gone silent. Preston Caldwell tried to maintain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding," he said confidently to the nearest reporter. "Everything our company has done is completely legal." Before the reporter could ask another question, Jonathan Reed calmly stepped forward. "Would you mind repeating that?" Preston frowned. "I said everything we've done is legal." Jonathan opened his briefcase once again. "Excellent." He held up several printed emails. Because according to these internal communications, you instructed your project manager to begin demolition 48 hours before receiving legal authorization. The reporter immediately pointed her microphone toward Jonathan. "Can you verify those documents?" Jonathan nodded. "They've already been authenticated by the survey contractor who copied them before resigning this morning." A murmur spread through the crowd. Several construction workers exchanged uneasy glances. One finally stepped forward. "My name is Eric Lawson." Every camera turned toward him. Eric removed his hard hat. "I operated Bulldozer 3 yesterday." Jonathan looked at him carefully. "Would you like to tell everyone what happened?" Eric swallowed hard. "I asked for more time." He pointed toward Darius. "I told management there were still families gathering their belongings. What happened?" Eric looked directly at Preston. "He threatened to fire me." Silence swept across the site. Another worker slowly stepped beside Eric. "My name's Luis Ortega." He folded his arms. "I heard the same conversation." A third employee joined them. "So did I." Within moments, 5 construction workers stood together. Every one of them confirmed the same story. Preston's attorney hurried toward him. "Don't answer another question." Preston ignored the advice. "They're lying." "No." Another voice answered. "They're finally telling the truth." Officer Daniel Foster walked toward the center of the crowd. He removed his patrol cap before speaking. "I've reviewed the temporary injunction." He looked directly at Preston. "The demolition should never have happened." Preston stared at him. "You were there yesterday." "I was." "And you supported the operation." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "I trusted the paperwork I was given." He looked back up. "I won't make that mistake twice." The crowd grew even quieter. Daniel turned toward one of his fellow officers. "Secure the equipment." The officer nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." One by one, officers stretched yellow police tape around the bulldozers. Every engine was shut down. No machine would move another inch. Meanwhile, Jonathan connected the flash drive to a portable monitor provided by one of the television crews. An email appeared on the screen. From Preston Caldwell. Subject: Start demolition before city approval. Delay costs money. I'll handle the paperwork later. Gasps erupted throughout the crowd. Jonathan opened another message. Remove every vehicle. Don't leave anything standing. I don't care if families are still packing. Then another. If anyone complains, security handles it. Walter, Steelwolf, Ramsey slowly turned toward Darius. You weren't imagining any of it. Darius simply stared at the screen. He had spent the last 2 days wondering whether he could have done something differently. Now he realized the truth. Nothing he had done would have changed Preston's decision. The cruelty had been intentional from the beginning. Rachel Monroe quietly knelt beside Ava. Sweetheart. Ava looked up. Does that mean Dad wasn't wrong? Rachel smiled gently. No. He never was. Tears rolled down Ava's cheeks. I knew it. Nearby reporters continued broadcasting live. One anchor spoke into the camera. This story is rapidly becoming one of the biggest abuse of power investigations our city has seen in years. Another reporter interviewed Walter. Why did you bring 80 writers here today? Walter looked toward Darius before answering. Because one hungry father reminded us what real honor looks like. He reached into his vest and removed the folded sandwich wrapper once more. This man had one meal. He held it up for the cameras. His little girl was waiting to eat. The reporters listened silently. He gave that meal to me because he thought I needed it more. Walter's voice grew heavier. I've served beside heroes. I've buried brothers. I've met governors, senators, and wealthy businessmen. But yesterday, a homeless father taught me more about character than any of them ever did. Across the lot, several displaced families began applauding. The applause spread. Construction workers joined. Volunteers followed. Police officers, reporters, even strangers who had stopped after seeing the live broadcast began clapping. Darius looked overwhelmed. You don't have to do this, Walter smiled. We're not applauding because you're homeless. He placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. We're applauding because you refused to let hardship change the kind of man you are. At that very moment, 3 black SUVs bearing the seal of the Phoenix City Attorney's Office entered the construction site. Behind them arrived investigators from the city's Office of Professional Standards. The lead investigator stepped out holding a thick binder. He walked directly toward Jonathan. We've reviewed the preliminary evidence. Jonathan nodded. That was fast. The mayor's office has been watching the live broadcast. The investigator turned toward Preston Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell. Preston's confident posture finally collapsed. We need you to remain here. For what? The investigator opened the binder. You are now the subject of an official investigation involving fraudulent permits, unlawful property destruction, possible evidence tampering, and conspiracy to violate municipal redevelopment regulations. Preston took one slow step backward. His attorney whispered urgently, Don't say another word. For the first time since anyone had met him, Preston Caldwell had no response. He simply watched as the empire he believed money could protect began crumbling before the eyes of the entire nation. And Walter knew something even bigger was still coming. Because justice wasn't finished. It was only beginning. The applause had barely faded when investigators approached Preston Caldwell. The lead investigator unfolded an official document. Mr. Caldwell, based on the evidence gathered today, your redevelopment activities are suspended immediately. Preston forced a smile. This is temporary. No. The investigator looked him straight in the eyes. This is the beginning. 2 detectives stepped beside him. We'll also need access to your company records. Preston's attorney quietly whispered, Don't resist. Across the construction site, dozens of Caldwell Urban Properties employees watched in stunned silence. Many had spent years believing Preston was untouchable. Now they watched him surrender his phone, his access badge, and finally the keys to his luxury SUV. The same man who had mocked a homeless father only hours earlier suddenly looked very small. Officer Daniel Foster walked toward Darius. I owe you an apology. Darius shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I do. Daniel's voice was sincere. I judged the situation before I understood the truth. He extended his hand. I'm sorry. Darius accepted it. Thank you for admitting it. Daniel smiled faintly. My father always said that the hardest words for an honest man are, "I was wrong." Nearby, Travis Mercer stood alone. No security guards remained beside him. Several had quietly removed their company jackets after learning the demolition had been illegal. One supervisor approached Travis carrying an envelope. "Corporate just called." Travis frowned. "What is it?" "Termination papers." He stared at the envelope. "They fired me." They fired everyone directly involved. Vanessa Pierce wasn't spared either. Her phone rang. She listened for less than 30 seconds before lowering it slowly. "They're letting me go." For the first time since the demolition began, neither of Preston's closest allies had anything left to say. Walter "Steel Wolf" Ramsey watched quietly. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Jonathan Reed approached, carrying another folder. "I have one more piece of news." Darius looked confused. "What now?" Jonathan smiled. Several local charities saw the live broadcast. He handed Darius a sheet of paper. "They've started a housing fund in your family's name." Darius blinked. "What?" Rachel Monroe laughed through happy tears. It reached $50,000 in less than 2 hours. Marcus Turner looked down at his phone. It just passed 100,000. Another writer raised his hand. 163. Before anyone could react, another notification appeared. The number climbed again. Television viewers from across the country had begun donating. Veterans, mechanics, teachers, truck drivers, single mothers, retirees, thousands of strangers who had never met Darius Bennett decided they wanted to help. Darius covered his mouth. "I don't know what to say." Walter answered gently, "You don't have to." The following week, the story dominated national headlines. Homeless father's last meal sparks national movement. 80 riders defend family after illegal demolition. Kindness returns tenfold. The city council voted unanimously to revoke Caldwell Urban Properties redevelopment contract. State investigators expanded their inquiry into financial misconduct and fraudulent permitting. Civil lawsuits followed. Families displaced from the property received temporary housing, while the city developed a legal relocation plan. The vacant lot that had once symbolized hopelessness became evidence in one of the state's largest redevelopment investigations. 3 weeks later, Walter invited Darius and Ava to the Steel Brotherhood Riders Clubhouse. Darius hesitated as they walked inside. The room erupted into applause. Not because they pitied him, because they respected him. Walter led him toward an old garage behind the clubhouse. Inside stood 6 service bays filled with motorcycles, pickup trucks, and classic cars. Mechanics stopped working as Darius entered. Walter smiled. "We've been needing someone to run this place." Darius looked around in disbelief. "You mean?" "We mean you." Marcus tossed him a clean set of mechanic coveralls. Across the back, embroidered in bold gold letters, were the words, "Shop Manager." Darius ran his fingers across the fabric. "I haven't worn coveralls in years." Walter smiled. "I think they still fit." Tears filled Darius's eyes as he slowly slipped them on. For the first time since losing his old business, he looked in the mirror and recognized the man staring back. Not a homeless father, not a victim, a mechanic, a leader, a provider. Outside, Ava wandered into a small classroom attached to the clubhouse. Several retired teachers volunteered there after school. Rachel knelt beside her. "There's someone who wants to meet you." A woman introduced herself as director of a local education foundation. "We heard about how hard you've worked." She handed Ava a blue envelope. Inside was a certificate, a full educational scholarship through high school, along with tutoring, books, and transportation. Ava looked at her father. "Dad," he could barely speak. "You earned that." Months later, Darius purchased a modest 3-bedroom home on a quiet street with a small garage behind it. The first thing he installed wasn't a television. It wasn't new furniture. It was a sturdy red toolbox. Ava laughed. "I knew that would be first." He grinned. Some habits never change. One crisp autumn afternoon, Darius and Ava left the grocery store carrying bags of food. Near the parking lot sat an elderly homeless man wrapped in a worn blanket. He looked hungry. Without hesitation, Ava reached into one of the bags. "Dad," Darius smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." Together they walked over. Ava handed the man a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. The old man looked up with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this?" Darius glanced lovingly at his daughter before answering. "Because someone once taught us that kindness never disappears. It simply finds its way home." Far across the parking lot, Walter watched from his motorcycle. He never interrupted. He simply smiled beneath his gray beard. The circle was complete. One meal. One choice. One act of compassion. It had saved far more than a single life. It had restored faith that even in a world filled with cruelty, one person willing to put someone else first could inspire an entire community to stand together. Sometimes justice begins in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with a badge. Sometimes it begins with power. But sometimes it begins with a hungry father who refuses to let another human being suffer alone.
True wealth is never measured by what you keep, but by what you're willing to give when you have almost nothing. One selfless act can inspire countless others to stand for justice. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us kindness is never wasted.